We now move to First Minister's question time. Question number 1, Ian Gray.
To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Well, later today it will give me a great pleasure to officially reopen the National Portrait Gallery here in Edinburgh. When one thinks of the great work of Glasgow Council and the Riverside Museum, the Robert Burns Museum, Stirling Palace, the new National Museum here in Edinburgh, the Victoria and Albert to come in Dundee, I think we should all, this day after St Andrew's Day, welcome what will be another fantastic jewel in Scotland's cultural crown.
Ian Gray.
It doesn't apply to the First Minister, or indeed to me, but I do hope some of his colleagues, and indeed some of mine and others, will realise it is December and find time today to shave off their Movember moustaches. They're to be congratulated for their fundraising, but enough is enough. It's time to... I want today to reiterate Scottish Labour's support for public sector workers and our support for the 300,000 Scots who took a stand yesterday. I know the First Minister opposed their action, but he tries to claim not to support the pension changes either. Can he explain then why his Scottish Public Pensions Agency made pension proposals even more punitive than the Tories?
First Minister.
Well, if Ian Gray had been at the debate yesterday, then he would have heard Mr Swinney refute that point made, I think, initially by a Tory researcher. Well, of course, given that Ian Gray is now using the lines from Tory researchers, no great surprise there. That was not the point of that particular document. The particular issue we challenged the UK government on and continue to challenge, and the thing that exercised probably more than any other factor the people yesterday supporting the strike and the hundreds of thousands of Scots will be affected, is that the levy, which is claimed to be to support pension plans, does not in fact support the pension plans. It's a straight smash and grab raid, as Mr Swinney described it yesterday. And that is a point we've been forcing and hammering away at the UK government on for some particular time. Now, I do feel a great surprise that Ian Gray doesn't acknowledge this, because after all, it was Richard Baker on the 21st of September who said in response to Mr Swinney outlining that particular policy, quote, "We agree with the Cabinet Secretary's analysis of the UK government's pensions policy." So given that the Labour opposition supported the SNP government back in September, why isn't Ian Gray still maintaining that position?
Ian Gray.
No, we oppose the UK pension changes. We still do. The question is, if the SNP do, why are they simply implementing them as asked by the UK government? And as for what was making the strikers angry yesterday, I'm not sure how the First Minister knows that, because he wasn't anywhere near any of the strikers except when he crossed their picket line. I'll tell him what was making them angry. What was making the nurses and teachers and council workers angry was that they were being asked to give more when they are already in the middle of a pay cut because of the pay freeze for the last 2 years. And that anger was exacerbated by their having heard on Tuesday George Osborne telling them that it will be cut, their pay will be cut again next year and the year after. But hang on. Public sector pay is mostly devolved. Can the First Minister confirm that he plans to pass on George Osborne's 1% pay cap?
First Minister.
Ian Gray must surely remember his remarks during the election campaign in BBC Online when he said there would have to be public sector wage restraint for the next 3 years. That's what he said during the election campaign. So we've got, during the election campaign, Ian Gray puts forward that position. In September, in answer to exactly the point that Mr Swinney made, that we would lose £500 million if we didn't implement the policy of the United Kingdom government. That's when his spokesman said he appreciates and supports the government's position as far as the UK government's pension changes were concerned. Now, if Ian Gray thinks that we can find £500 million in response to the blackmail letter from Danny Alexander, then he better start telling this chamber where exactly it's going to come from. And furthermore, at what stage between September, when Labour supported the position that we had to adopt following that blackmail letter, did Ian Gray suddenly change his mind? And perhaps he'll also tell us when he decided not to cross picket lines, since he's done it twice in the last 18 months in this Parliament.
Ian Gray.
There was a lot of ways there to avoid saying yes. Yes, he is going to pass on the 1% pay cap, because I heard John Swinney on the radio 2 days ago doing everything to try and avoid saying a simple yes. But that is the answer. The Tories cut public sector pay and the SNP implement the cut. The Tories cut pensions and the SNP implement the cut. The Tories cut public sector jobs and the SNP implement the cut, only deeper and faster. And the Tories cut capital expenditure, and yes, the SNP implement that cut too, only deeper and faster. So what's the difference between the Tories and the SNP?
Ian Gray now says he supports the strikers, but Ed Miliband opposes the strike. Ian Gray refuses to go into work in the Scottish Parliament, but Ed Miliband goes into work at Westminster. I mean, I know that Ian's on the way out as Labour leader in Scotland, but I do think there should be a little bit of coordination between himself and his colleagues in Westminster. The way to stop this Parliament and this government being hamstrung by the policies of the United Kingdom government is to give us the financial independence that we require in order to do that. And given Ian Gray has been foolish enough to repeat the mistakes of Richard Baker, as well as not supporting him as far as pension policy was concerned, then can I just explain to him the reality of Barnett funding as it affects the Capital Dell. Capital Dell has declined by almost 40%. That is part of the Barnett formula. It was exactly the same policy that was going to be pursued by Alistair Darling. Exactly. But we're in a rising trend of capital investment in Scotland, thanks to two things. Mr Swinney's the policy of devoting £750 million from resource to capital, and the NPD programme, which will add £2.5 billion. Now, for the sake and for the hopes that we'll finally get this point settled, I shall have these figures on that table on the record. And I challenge Messrs Baker and Gray, if they can agree, to come back every week and hear the same story. You cannot hide behind Tory cuts when Alistair Darling was going to implement the cuts deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher.
Ian Gray.
We know that the First Minister would like more financial powers. He'd like powers over corporation tax. Why? Because he wants to cut taxes for banks and big business. Even further than the Tories. I hear the meandering bluster, but I see the cuts to pensions, to jobs and to pay. Isn't it true that we know a man's heart by his actions? On pensions, public sector jobs and pay cuts, 300,000 Scots took a stand yesterday, and yes, we took a stand with them. When is Alex Salmond going to stand up for what he says and stop just doing Tory bidding every time?
First Minister.
Right, where do we start? Well, of course, it was Ian Gray's predecessor, Wendy Alexander, who supported corporation tax being devolved to this Parliament if it was devolved to Northern Ireland. And, of course, it's one of Ian Gray's potential successors, Ken McIntosh, who told us this week that he intends to cut and end the small business bonus. So not only is there no synchronisation between Labour at Westminster and Labour in Scotland, there's no synchronisation whatsoever between Labour's past leader, Labour's present leader, and one of the one to know you'll have to wait a few weeks, Ken, before you can adopt that particular position. Now, as far as our relationship with our staff is concerned, then I'll tell you why it's appreciated. It's appreciated because, uniquely in these islands, we have a no compulsory redundancy policy in the public sector that we control. And we've implemented the living wage across the public sector. But if Ian Gray wants us to get out from under Tory policies, then give this Parliament, this government, the financial and economic powers that we require in order to do that. And that is what people voted for in May, and that's what they're going to vote for again.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans to meet the Secretary of State for Scotland in the near future.
Ms Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister likes to claim the credit when he thinks something is better in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK. But will he step up to the mark when Scotland is falling behind? The families of young children in England receive 20% more free childcare for their 3- and 4-year-olds than we get in Scotland. They get 15 hours a week, we get 12.5. And this week, the Chancellor extended free provision to over 250,000 2-year-olds from the most disadvantaged backgrounds south of the border. Evidence shows that the early years are the most crucial in a child's development. I believe that young families deserve support, particularly in these tough times. This is a devolved issue. In a minute, I know you're keen, but in a minute, I want Scots families to get a better deal, and will the First Minister pledge to at least match what's happening in England?
Now, First Minister.
The reason I was so anxious to say to Ruth Davidson is that during the debate we had this morning, a number of her colleagues complimented the Scottish Government in the approach to early intervention. And as we roll out the Early Intervention Fund, then she'll find that our support for young families, it doesn't just match what's being done in south of the border, however belatedly, but it will be a substantial enhancement in terms of the early intervention for families and young people.
Ruth Davidson.
Great, and I'll claim that as a partial victory for Scotland's families. So now I want to know when and how it will be implemented, and I would invite him and his Cabinet Secretary to a meeting with me and my team to take this forward to help Scotland's families. It's time we turned words into action. So will the First Minister, Presiding Officer, will the First Minister meet with me before Christmas on this issue?
First Minister.
Is that the whole team that will have to meet? But it's approaching Christmas, so let's be gracious. And yes, of course, I shall meet the leader of the party and whichever members of her numerous team she wants to bring along.
Jamie McGregor, constituency question.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware of the closure today of the A83 trunk road in both directions following yet another landslide up the Risp be Thankful on the A83. Given this is the key road route in and out of large parts of Argyll, including Dunoon and Campbellton and Kintyre, can he assure me that the Scottish Government will do all in its power to ensure the road is reopened as soon as possible and that action will be taken to prevent further such landslides which are potentially devastating for the economy of Argyll and Bute?
First Minister.
Well, yes, I can. With permission, Presiding Officer, could I just say a bit about the extent of the difficulties on the A83? There was a large landslip closed the road at 7 o'clock this morning. The site is approximately half a mile away from the previous significant landslip location. Approximately 80 to 100 tonnes of material has been deposited on the road. Engineers are on site as we speak, but there can be no clearance operation until the water has subsided and a risk assessment of any further slippage is carried through. The local radio stations have been informed of the situation. A diversion route has been put in place and communicated to the public. Details have also been communicated to the relevant ferry companies. The Traffic Scotland website, internet radio site, being regularly updated with the latest on both issues. We can't as yet confirm when the road will reopen. We expect it may be closed for up to 24 hours, but I can assure the Chamber that the local member and other interested MSPs will be informed as developments take place today.
Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister was aware of the situation in Glasgow with the ALIOs. Can I ask the First Minister what discussion the Government has had with Glasgow City Council regarding the review of the arm's length companies and how this will impact on frontline services?
First Minister.
Well, it is a matter for the Glasgow City Council. There will be a number of concerns that have been made. Perhaps I could arrange for a meeting between the constituency member and the relevant minister to see how we can take forward, which is, however, it has to be said, a local government matter.
Neil Findlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Select, the Electrical Employers Organisation and Unite the Union are both speaking with one voice about the provocative and intimidatory actions of rogue employers in the sector, led by Balfour Beatty. Will the First Minister take an urgent personal interest in this so that we can avoid a crisis this winter in the already struggling construction industry?
First Minister.
Well, if the member wants to come forward with the information, perhaps I could arrange a meeting between him and Mr Swinney with whatever representatives he wants to bring along and to see if there's anything the Scottish Government can do to facilitate a settlement of the potential dispute.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
Last month, I asked the First Minister when he will make up his mind on college funding. Last week, the National Union of Students launched a campaign called Our Fight, Our Future. It hopes to protect college student support, protect teaching quality and stop cuts to college places. Yet we have seen Angus College fear 400 places could be lost and another 9,000 across the country. The First Minister's government is proposing a £40 million cut to colleges, but has more than £67 million in extra money available and unallocated. It's a simple equation. Will the First Minister today join those who want to protect Scotland's colleges, join the dots in his own government and tell us he will use part of the £67 million to help colleges and their students?
First Minister.
Well, can I say that Willie Rennie says these things are simple calculations. Can I point out that the statements we've seen up to and including Tuesday have had some positive consequentials for the Scottish budget. They've also had negative consequentials, which the UK Government have been unwilling to specify to date. For example, the assumption of 1% on public sector pay, which was in the autumn statement, has serious consequentials in terms of the Scottish budget, negative consequentials. So I think it's understandable, wise, indeed essential, that Mr Swinney, as Finance Secretary, looks to see what the overall balance is in terms of the impact before he comes to his conclusions and makes his announcement to Parliament. I think anything else would be particularly strange. And I know that Willie Rennie really wanted in his question to welcome the substantial announcement over and above consequentials of £6 million a year, which was made today to help young people in Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
I welcomed that announcement this morning, but he made that announcement this morning. Why can't he make the announcement on the colleges as well? It's completely unacceptable that he's treating colleges in this way. He spent a 10-minute speech this morning on youth unemployment, but there was not one single word about extra funds for the colleges. He spent 6 minutes arguing about statistics. Surely the only two statistics that matter is he's got at least £67 million he wasn't expecting when he published his plans. And he was planning to cut colleges by £40 million. He doesn't have to do it anymore. Why can't he save the day and simply make up his mind? Why the dodge? Why the delay?
First Minister.
Right. Just in terms of college funding, I think fair-minded people looking at college funding will look both at revenue and capital funding. For example, in the year 2002-2003, when Ian Gray was an education minister, the college capital budget was £21 million in total. In 2013-14, thanks to the introduction of the NPD programme and the major renovations supporting the college reorganisation across Scotland, the figure will be £138 million times, a factor of almost 7. I've already explained, and if the member had been listening carefully to the statement this morning, he would have learned and understood that the discussions that are taking place with local government and with the voluntary sector include the colleges. So it's not accurate to say that the announcement this morning was in any way irrelevant to the colleges. It was certainly relevant to the young people of Scotland. And finally, in terms of the UK government, and I really do think it's time to challenge some of the humbug we heard from the Tory and Liberal members and contributions today. The Red Book, published in the budget, outlines what's happening to the college and further education sector south of the border. In England, the UK government is reducing investment in further education by £1 billion, from £4 billion to £3 billion, a 25% reduction in cash terms, over 7%, much higher than any prospective tightening of the college budget in Scotland. Yes, I'm just pointing out to Willie Rennie what's actually happening south of the border. Exactly. The importance of it is that until we achieve financial independence, our budget in Scotland is unfortunately dependent on decisions that are made elsewhere. That's why I think when any Liberal Democrat or Conservative comes to this chamber and starts to weep crocodile tears for investment in public service in Scotland, they'll be either laughed at by public sector workers or given the same treatment as Danny Alexander yesterday.
Question number 4, Graham Day.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's autumn statement.
First Minister.
Well, the Office of Budget Responsibility has confirmed that the Government's Plan A south of the border is clearly not working. It's resulted in slower growth, higher unemployment and deeper spending cuts. In light of the worsening economic outlook, the Chancellor needed to set out a bold plan to support growth. The measures announced fall short of the action required. Indeed, the OBR itself states that they will have, quote, a limited impact, unquote, on the economy. The limited additional capital credentials which were received are welcome. However, 3/4 of the funding will not be received until after 2013, despite the obvious need for urgent action this day. The lack of action by the UK Government highlights the clear need for this Parliament to have the greater financial responsibility to give us the levers to grow the economy and protect our frontline services.
Graham Day.
Following George Osborne's admission of defeat on his own economic Plan A and the miserable legacy of the Labour Party who created this economic crisis, does the First Minister agree it's high time this Parliament was given the necessary financial powers to run its own affairs, so that Scotland doesn't have to be burdened by a union dividend of economic doom and gloom?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. But in illustration of the impact of the autumn statement, previously, before the autumn statement, the cumulative reduction in capital spend over the spending review period implemented in Scotland as a direct result of the capital reduction south of the border was £3.7 billion. After the spending review, in magnificent terms, that comes from £3.7 billion reduction to £3 billion reduction. So I just want, when Tory and Liberal members make these points about the autumn review, to remember that a £3 billion reduction in direct capital investment in Scotland across this spending review is not something either to cheer or to be satisfied about.
Rhoda Grant.
Officer, the First Minister will be aware of the £100 million allocation made for superfast broadband in our cities, while many people in our rural areas have no broadband at all. Will he make representations for a change of focus for this funding towards rural areas, and in particular to the Highlands and Islands, to make sure that project benefits the people in our most rural communities?
First Minister.
Yes, I support the nature of that question. In many ways, the allocation of broadband was disappointing. We are aware and have prioritised the requirement and need for superfast broadband to be rolled out across the country, hence the £140 million investment. I'll be delighted if the member wants to speak to the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure to talk about this point in great detail. It is a highly important point in terms of the future development, not just of the rural areas of Scotland, but Scotland as a whole.
Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I feel the First Minister was slightly ungracious in relation to the autumn statement that was made. Will he reverse that and welcome the announcements in relation to fuel duty? Will he welcome the announcements in relation to credit easing? Will he welcome the announcements in relation to the youth contract? And will he welcome the announcements in relation to the additional capital spend that we'll get in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I wish Gavin Brown had listened to my answer earlier before he made that point. He's asking me to welcome the fact that reduction in capital spending has been reduced from a 3.7 billion reduction to a 3 billion reduction. Now, I know that in the Scrooge-like world of the inner recesses of the Conservative Party, only a reduction of £3 billion is something to be rejoiced and welcome. I think in the reality of the streets and homes of Scotland, they would want to see a Scottish economy which is actually increasing investment at this time to bring our people back into employment. That's the sort of thing we'll welcome. And in following through the objectives of his question, won't he join his previously and unfortunately defeated leadership candidate in calling for additional powers to this Parliament? So when he asks the question, I can say what we are doing for Scotland as opposed to what the Tories are doing to Scotland.
Question number 5, Bruce Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to tackle human trafficking.
First Minister.
Well, human trafficking is an abhorrent crime. The Scottish Government is committed to making further progress in tackling the criminals who engage in it. The recent report from Helena Kennedy and from the Equality and Human Rights Commission acknowledges that the Scottish Government have taken important steps in recent years in anti-trafficking. It helpfully sets out recommendations for further action. We have provided additional funding of £4 million over a 2-year period in 2009 to 2011 to the Scottish Crime Drugs Enforcement Agency to boost capacity to tackle organised crime, and within that provide Scotland's first dedicated expert resource to build the intelligence necessary to support and improve human trafficking investigation.
Hugh Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and to the First Minister for that answer. Particularly in light, as Helena Kennedy says in her report of the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games, there is some urgency around making sure that our approach to human trafficking is correct. And Baroness Kennedy raises a number of concerns about the interaction between police and UKBA, the low awareness of trafficking in Scotland, the definition in law where 2 offences for the same crime exist, lack of intelligence, a lack of prosecution expertise, as well as services for victims. Does the First Minister take the view that there is a case for a review of the legislation in this area, and will he commit to ask the Cabinet Secretary for Parliamentary Business to bring forward an early debate so that parties across the Chamber can discuss this very important issue in some more detail?
First Minister.
I'll speak to the business manager to allow that to happen. But can I just quote the words of Baroness Kennedy herself in a letter to the Justice Secretary? Quote, "In conducting this inquiry, I have learned not only how seriously you and the First Minister take the horrifying practice of human trafficking, but in particular your personal determination to eradicate it in Scotland. I would also like to reiterate my appreciation for the consistently helpful input and cooperation of the Justice Directorate have given to me and my team in conducting this inquiry." I merely point out to the member, given the enthusiasm with which we cooperated and conducted the inquiry, he can be absolutely certain that will pursue its welcome recommendations to fruition.
Briefly, Christina McKelvey.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. In a recent report on migration and trafficking by this Parliament's Equal Ops Committee, UKBA were harshly criticised for the way in which they determine the status of a trafficked person. The report called for the status of individuals suspected of being trafficked to be determined by local government social work services. Would the First Minister agree with me that there is a need now to have these issues devolved to the Scottish Parliament?
First Minister.
Well, I've heard a number of reactions to points being made about why this Parliament should have additional powers. But I cannot see for the life of me why a request for obvious reason for this Parliament to have the powers that we would wish as a national Parliament so as we can work in the benefit of all our people to be greeted with cries of shame. And I think that the Labour members who do that are rather allowing their antipathy to the SNP, their difficulty in adjusting to the reduced minority position in Scottish politics to get the better of them. When people make reasonable points, then give them a reasonable response.
Number 6, Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister how many cases the Scottish Government considers might be affected retrospectively by the Double Jeopardy Scotland Act 2011.
First Minister.
Well, double jeopardy legislation that came into force on Monday sets out the circumstances in which it will be possible to retry an acquitted person. It was always envisaged that the Act will only be used in exceptional cases, in particular where there is new evidence which, had it been available before, would have been highly likely to have led to a conviction. Specific cases, of course, are a matter for the law officers, particularly the Lord Advocate, who exercises his prosecution functions independently of other ministers.
Briefly, Ms Graham.
I thank the First Minister for that reply, but given the enactment of double jeopardy and now the potential abolition of corroboration, as recommended by Lord Carloway, does he consider that raises concerns that the interaction of both might make prosecutors, indeed police, less rigorous in gathering evidence for trial, or, to put it bluntly, give the Crown Office, if it gets it wrong in the first place, a second go? And if he shares my concerns, will he give this Parliament an assurance that we'll be given time to consider this implication?
First Minister.
Well, Lord Carloway has provided an in-depth report. I agree there will need to be a period of reflection, analysis and consideration following on from this. The Scottish Government will work closely with this Parliament, with the wider legal community, as it moves towards that coherent package of reform. The process began on Tuesday, of course, when Lord Carloway himself appeared before the Justice Committee, and will continue this afternoon in the debate scheduled to be held in this chamber. Now, police and prosecutors are acutely aware that presenting a strong case can be critical in securing an early guilty plea from the accused, which spares the victim and witnesses the ordeal of giving evidence. For these reasons, I don't believe there is any risk that standards of evidence gathering will decline. But I turn Christine Graham to the points that I do accept that following Lord Carloway's report there has to be that period of reflection, analysis and consideration, and totally recognise the parliamentary role in that period.
That ends First Minister's questions. A point of order from Ken McIntosh.
Presiding Officer, I wouldn't wish the First Minister to get off to a bad start in misinterpreting my questions, statements or policies. And so can I assume that it was a genuine misunderstanding, and in the interest of clarity, let him know that my plans for the small business bonus scheme would be to take the £130 million and give it to the same small businesses, but only if they take on an employee, not only boosting economic growth, but reducing youth unemployment by 20,000. And I would urge the First Minister to look at the evidence.
Please sit down. That's not a point of order, but you've made your position clear to the chamber.